We all make decisions billions of times in your lifetime. According to research, a person makes hundreds of decisions in just 24 hours. Many decisions such as what to eat, what to do, the road to take, the seat to sit in are easily made by the human brain. But not all decisions are that easy. The more difficult the situation, the more difficult it can be to make the decisions. The decisions of one soldier can affect the lives of millions. The decisions taken by soldiers in the Russian army surprised everyone. However, the person who was most surprised by this decision was Russian President Vladimir Putin. Putin is allegedly very angry about this decision. So what exactly is happening on the battlefield? What was the last decision of the Russian soldiers? As Anchor Daily News team, we investigated for you. Let's start if you're ready. The decisions of Russian soldiers have been the talk of the world for a long time because Russian soldiers are making decisions that affect the course of this war. Russian soldiers are trying to surrender to the Ukrainian army or to revolt within the army. Thousands of Russian soldiers have left the army. The surrender of Russian soldiers to the Ukrainian army is one of the most interesting events in this war. Ukrainian government made many efforts to get Russian soldiers to surrender. These efforts paid off and Russian soldiers started to surrender en masse. But the story of the Russian soldiers who surrendered today was extraordinary. Soldiers in the Russian army had been thinking about surrendering for a long time. 3 friends in the mechanized tanker started talking about it among themselves. The soldiers knew about the Ukrainian government's I Want to Live project. As you know, this project is designed to facilitate the surrender of Russian soldiers to the Ukrainian army. Through this project, the Ukrainian army communicates with Russian soldiers. A safe plan is prepared for Russian soldiers who want to surrender. It is known that thousands of Russian soldiers have surrendered thanks to this site. This project is attracting a lot of attention from international organizations. This move by the Ukrainian government has completely changed the course of this war. Ukrainian President Zelensky is influencing world history by implementing such innovative projects. Zelensky's strategic intelligence and innovative ideas are influencing the course of this war. Because of this project, interest in Zelensky increased even more. Zelensky's project also affected the soldiers in the tank unit of the Russian army. The soldiers called the I Want to Live hotline to surrender, but these soldiers said something very important on the phone. The soldiers said that they would do their best to end this war as soon as possible, and that they were waiting for instructions from the Ukrainian authorities. Secret talks between Ukrainian authorities and Russian soldiers continued for some time. Russian soldiers tried not to take an active part in any conflict during this period. They often called in sick and did not leave the unit. In the meantime, the soldiers tried to learn more about Russia's offensive plans. In the meantime, they made a very important plan. After sharing this plan with Ukrainian officials, they took action. They were all very excited. They gathered their courage and started to implement their plan. Soldiers loaded many weapons and bulbs into 3 tanks in the unit's warehouse. Russian tanks were assigned to patrol around the trenches using these tanks. The Russian soldiers started patrolling around the Russian trenches, but then the soldiers started to drive away quickly. The Russian commanders could not understand what happened. Soon, the Russian tanks moved out of sight and reached the Ukrainian army. Russian soldiers got out of the tank and surrendered to the Ukrainian army. This is how the Russian tanks ended up in the hands of the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army has also placed the weapons inside these tanks in storage. These tanks and weapons will be used against the Russian army. The surrendered Russian soldiers were first taken to a rest area. Then they were given hot food and clean clothes. The beds were prepared for them to sleep and rest. The Russian soldiers felt very lucky to surrender. So why do the Russian soldiers hijack the tanks and surrender? Russian soldiers know that the Russian army must withdraw in order to end this war as soon as possible. Because this war is going on right now on Ukrainian territory. Ukrainian people want the Russian army to withdraw from this region in order to gain their independence. This war will continue until the Russian army withdraws from the occupied cities. Russian soldiers want to withdraw from the cities. However, Russian commanders do not respond to this request because Putin gives strict instructions to occupy these cities. But Russian soldiers do not want to die because of Putin's political goals. On the other hand, there are many problems in the Russian army. There are 22 republics in the Russian Federation. People of many ethnicities and religious beliefs live in these regions. So the soldiers in the Russian army are also of many different races and religious beliefs. Due to the high level of racism in Russia, there are also a crisis within the Russian army. Russian commanders are very harsh towards minorities. This makes the minorities serving the Russian army even more angry. The soldiers who surrendered tanks to the Ukrainian army were also very angry about the divisive attitudes in the army. These soldiers decided to hand over the weapons of the Russian army to the Ukrainian army. In this way, it is thought that the Ukrainian army will be more likely to win this war. Russia's heavy defeat in this war is expected to have many consequences, but the most important of these consequences is the possibility of the collapse of the Russian Federation. According to experts, if the Russian army loses this war, the Russian Federation could collapse. Many countries of the Russian Federation are demanding independence. If Putin loses this war, it is thought that the demands for the independence in Russia will increase. As a result of this process, Russia could fall apart, especially in regions like Chechnya and Bashkortostan. The demands for independence are very strong. If the Ukrainian army wins this war, these regions could also gain their independence from Russia. The soldiers who handed over the Russian tanks to the Ukrainian army heeded these warnings of experts. Russian soldiers did this for their cities to gain independence and for Russia to get rid of Putin. Anti-Putin sentiment in Russia is growing every day. On the other hand, the number of soldiers surrendering in this way in the Russian army is increasing. Russian soldiers managed to surrender en masse. Putin has sent orders to commanders to prevent Russian soldiers from surrendering, but this order is useless. All Russian soldiers want this war to end as soon as possible. This may also affect Putin's policies. The battle for the city of Bahamut has become the most crucial part of the Ukraine war. Both Ukraine and Russia have focused their efforts on this small city. In recent months, despite all its impossibilities, Russia is attacking with all its might to make a tangible gain in the war that has been going on for more than a year. But it can't get past the steel curtain of Ukraine's defense. The Ukrainian army, on the other hand, perfectly demonstrates its defensive capabilities while at the same time inflicting heavy damage on the Russian army with offensive operations. The other day, the large ammunition depot of the Russian army near Bahamut was destroyed by the Ukrainian army. The huge arsenal of the Russians was used jointly by the Chechen troops of Wagner and Kadyrov. Considering the current shortage of ammunition, as well as the serious logistical problems in this aspect of the front line, the loss of large numbers of shells will put the Russian army in serious trouble in the later days of the war. According to preliminary data, it was reported that a few days ago in the explosion of an ammunition depot in the south of Bahamut, Russian soldiers were also killed in addition to the ammunition of the Russian army. But there is still no official information about how many soldiers died. It was probably the troops of Wagner and Kadyrov that were destroyed here. It is known that this direction is actively used by the armed forces of Ukraine, which is trying to unblock their territory to withdraw some of the units from the city. But the Wagner PMC fighters are also located here in defensive positions. To this date, battles for Bahamut continue actively. At the same time, it is known that Russian troops control about 30% of the territory of the city. And at the moment the armed forces of Ukraine are advancing from the eastern direction also. Efforts by the Wagner PMC to fight on the front lines and try to break through the Ukrainian defense lines are also fruitless. After 14 Leopard tanks from Poland were sent to the region, Russian troops and Wagner PMC began to lose their effectiveness in the region. Wagner is constantly making publications and statements that he is advancing in Bahamut and pushing back the Ukrainian army. But contrary to what is believed, the opposite is true. The Ukrainian army does not hesitate to use its advanced weapons against the Wagner troops, who, together with the Russian troops, suffered huge losses in Bahamut. Ukraine's Western partners rolled up their sleeves in order to increase Ukraine's war effort and not lose its frontline superiority. Tanks committed by the USA and UK gradually began to enter the Ukrainian army inventory. On the other hand, there is participation from many Western countries in the tank coalition led by Poland, and the number of tanks to be given to Ukraine from the coalition officials is astonishing. All of these efforts, of course, are taking place in order for Ukraine to win the war and to prevent the harmful policies of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Particularly NATO member Eastern European countries know that if Russia wins the Ukraine war, it will be their turn, and they support Ukraine in its just struggle with all their might. We can easily see on the front line that Ukraine has not left these supports unanswered. After the Ukrainian army received the bombs of the JDAM family from the USA, these weapons began to be used to attack the territory of Bahamut and its surroundings. These aerial bombs are used, among other things, to attack Wagner troops and Russian army elements stationed in Bahamut. Since such aerial bombs can be launched from distances of up to 72 kilometers and the damage they inflict is huge, we can say that it is the end game for Wagner PMC. The Ukrainian army has not yet made a statement about the use of such weapons, but the US has previously confirmed that these weapons are being used by the Ukrainian army. The ammunition is most likely used by MiG-29 and Su-27 aircraft in service with the Ukrainian armed forces. Nevertheless, the fact that the Ukrainian army has reached the stage of ending the Wagner presence in Bahamut shows us that victory is near for Bahamut. So do the initiatives of the Ukrainian army prevent the attacks of the Russian army? The answer to that is, unfortunately, no. Despite significant losses, the Russian army continues offensive operations in Lyman, Bahamut, Avdiivka, Marinka, and Shakhtarsk directions. In the past day, units of the Ukraine Defense Forces repelled more than 100 Russian attacks in the indicated directions. During the day, the Ukrainian Air Force carried out 10 attacks on the areas where the Russian troops were concentrated. Ukrainian missile and artillery units struck 5 areas where Russian troops were deployed. Russian personnel and military equipment, as well as 3 ammunition depots, and for electronic warfare systems were destroyed by the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian General Staff emphasizes that the Russian Federation is using terrorist tactics, bombing settlements indiscriminately, and this is a grave violation of international humanitarian law. In the past day, the Russian army carried out 5 missile attacks, mainly on civilian infrastructure objects in the Sumy and Donetsk regions. There were reported deaths and injuries among civilians. The Russian army also carried out 35 airstrikes and 76 attacks using multiple launch rocket systems. But the majority of these attacks were repelled by Ukrainian defense troops. Still, the threat of new missile strikes on Ukrainian soil remains high, and the Ukrainian defense forces are focused on future attacks with the losses of the Russian army in recent days. The loss of soldiers of the Russian army since February 2022, when the war started, is around 160,000, according to the Ukrainian military. Russia allegedly launched more than 100 unsuccessful attacks on Ukraine in one day. The alleged attacks are the latest indication that he is trying to advance the special military operation launched by Russian President Vladimir Putin. Putin's forces continued to stagnate in Ukraine after more than a year of conflict, with conflicts largely concentrated in Ukraine's easternmost regions, including the Donbass. Russia continued to lay claim to areas where it failed to succeed, including the eastern city of Bahamut, where some of the conflict's most intense fighting took place. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported earlier in the week that its forces had repulsed several attacks from 5 key cities, including Bahamut, amid speculation earlier in the week that Russia could approach the city. The Russian military is not giving up its efforts to continue the war in Ukraine. Despite the significant losses, the Russian army continues its offensive activities in the directions of Limansky, Bahamut, Avdiivka, Mariinsky, and Shakhtar. The last-day units of the Ukrainian Defense Forces repelled 102 Russian attacks. On these lines, the Russian army also carried out other attacks, including 3 missile attacks on the city of Sloviansk. Amid the setbacks, Russia turned to attacks on Ukraine's civil and energy infrastructure during the winter months to put more pressure on Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky to get to the negotiating table. Russia also conducted 8 air strikes and carried out 49 bombardments from bottom-firing jet systems. The Ukrainian military has accused Russia of using terrorist tactics against Ukraine, the latest in allegations that Russia violated human rights throughout the war. It was alleged that the Russian Federation grossly violated international humanitarian law standards and continued to use terrorist tactics by indiscriminately bombing Ukrainian settlements. Ukraine claimed that it repelled these attacks, as Moscow seeks a rare victory after months of stagnation. Both Russia and Ukraine continued to fight for control of Bahamut, which experts say bears more symbolic significance for Russia. Ukraine has 2 current targets for Bahamut: to reduce as much as possible the combat-ready personnel of the Russian army and to squeeze them into several grueling key battles, interrupting their offensive and concentrating elsewhere the resources of the Ukrainian army for the spring counteroffensive. You, our esteemed followers, know now, like the whole world, that by another place here you mean Crimea. The Ukrainian army and the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, say at every opportunity that Crimea should be liberated from Russian control and emphasized that steps have been taken in this regard. The biggest news is coming from the Donetsk region. Here, Russian forces decided to deliver the decisive blow, and after relocating additional heavy assault units to the Avdiivka direction, they started attacking Ukrainian positions with tanks all over the front line. Ukrainian forces have already destroyed dozens of tanks in each direction. However, it looks like this battle is not going to finish overnight. Last time I told you that after a series of unsuccessful assaults, Russian forces in Avdiivka finally received substantial reinforcements of fresh troops, including newly mobilized soldiers and also a lot of armor. I also told you that because Russian forces became less constrained by losses, they managed to take Bazela and Krasnohorivka. The freshest reports suggest that the Russians immediately started moving in multiple directions at once, namely towards Nova Klanova and Berts, in order to maintain the momentum of advancement and expand their bridgehead as fast as possible. Russian forces deployed a lot of tanks and armored vehicles to facilitate further movement of their infantry. Simultaneously, after retreating from Krasnohorivka, Ukrainian forces urgently engaged additional units to stabilize the front line. The extensive use of tanks by Russians has been noted already during the battles east of Krasnohorivka, so Ukrainians have deployed more mobile irregular formations to mitigate this problem. One of the irregular units operating in the Donetsk region is a unit of special operators, White Wolves. 2 days before Russians launched another wave of assaults, White Wolves released a video showing how they destroyed 10 Russian tanks during the night in order to undermine the ability of Russians to penetrate Ukrainian defenses. As a result, the Ukrainian General Staff reported that the Russian attack on Novokulanova was repelled. If you look at the topographic map, we can see that Russians control 2 important hills north of Krasnohorivka while Ukrainians are located in the lowlands. So Russians have a tactical advantage in this regard. However, because of the scattered farmland facilities, small lakes and ravines breaking through Ukrainian defenses here proved to be too difficult. Russian forces also increased the intensity of their attacks to the south of Avdiivka. Here, Russian forces have been struggling for a long time to breach the Ukrainian defense in front of Vojny. Geolocated footage shows that recently Russian tanks tried to move around and assault Ukrainians from the flank. Ukrainian 35th Marine Brigade timely spotted the attackers and destroyed several Russian tanks and armored vehicles. Ukrainian 53rd Mechanized Brigade also reported about Russian advances south of Avdiivka, more specifically from Opiton. This time, Russian forces were more successful and, despite the best Ukrainian efforts, managed to breach Ukrainian defenses and got closer to the city itself. However, it seems like the engagement of so much armor in the south was just to immobilize Ukrainian troops before their main attack. After Russian forces in the south successfully drew Ukrainian attention to this region, and in some places like Opiton managed to entangle Ukrainians in positional fights, Russian forces in Krasnohorivka made another push and achieved the most significant results in the most unexpected area. Today, it was reported that Russian forces conducted a heavy mechanized assault on Stepov. Some sources reported that Russians managed to cross the railways and establish partial control over the village. Right now, Ukrainians are urgently relocating troops to Burtsk. Some Russian sources have already confirmed that one Ukrainian tank unit has already arrived in Stuparva to push Russians out. If you look at the topographic map, we can see that the Ukrainians are controlling an artificial hill, which should give them a lot of control over the surrounding area. The fact that Russians have to maintain positions on the other side of the railway embankment complicates the situation for Russians even more and makes it extremely unstable. This means that the Russians will either shortly make an even bigger mechanized assault with the goal of taking not only Stopover but also Burtsk, or they will be completely destroyed. Overall, substantial reinforcements of the Russian forces in the VUCA direction allowed Russians to open multiple lines of attack along the whole front line, fixed Ukrainian troops in low-priority directions, and generate a breakthrough to the north of Avdiivka. So far, Ukrainians seem to be doing everything they can. They mine the areas of advance and they engage a lot of drones, artillery, and aviation. The number of tanks and armored vehicles engaged over the last week reminds us what we saw in Volodar. Russians are trying to encircle Avdiivka as fast as possible. So if Ukrainians manage to slow them down enough, then Russians may once again run out of armor and troops before they secure crucial gains.